Hi everyone, here we are with our weekly chapter summary. This is about chapter 12. There's only 2 chapters to go this week and then next week, and then a final exam, but we're pretty much done the course, so congratulations. It's been an interesting semester, but we've made it this far, which is great. So this chapter is all about intelligence and creativity. So for what I'm going to do in this video is kind of just talk in general terms about what is intelligence, maybe some different ways of measuring it, this idea of G. We'll mention the Flynn effect, which I think is quite interesting. We'll go on and talk about Sternberg's theory of successful intelligence, and then Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences. And then we'll finish off with this idea of expertise in creativity. So to start off, obviously intelligence is something that's been much studied over a long time, more than a century now. It's clearly of interest to many different groups of people, including just lay people like ourselves and scientists as well. One of the hard things about intelligence, the study of intelligence, is really how to measure it. How do you really measure intelligence? And I'm sure you've heard of different arguments saying that X intelligence test is biased or it might not measure exactly what we're looking at. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind as you read this entire chapter, that although we've done a lot of research in the area, we're still not, at least in my opinion, we still haven't really reached that plateau or that summit of really understanding what intelligence is and how to accurately measure it. That accurate measurement of it is what's missing, I think. So to begin with, we've got the Binet-Simon test. This was something that was created by a couple of French researchers back 100 years ago. And it was created because of a request by the French education authorities who wanted a way of assessing the benefit of schooling. So does schooling really help, was the question. So they wanted to measure children to see if they are actually getting any benefits from going to school. Hopefully they are, but this was the general idea. And that was kind of the beginning of how we measure intelligence in general, right? And what they did basically was try and distinguish between normal and subnormal intelligence, right? Here's an original question from this. Which of each pair of faces is prettier? Kind of weird, but you can see how sometimes things are, for lack of better terms, in the eye of the beholder. So there could be bias even creeping in these types of questions, but this is kind of obvious, I think. But just so you get an example. So their definition of intelligence, and again, this is pretty hard to define, but their definition of intelligence was a fundamental faculty, the alteration of lack of which is of the utmost importance for practical life. A little wordy there, but that's what they came up with. This faculty is judgment, otherwise called good sense, practical sense, initiative, the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances, to judge well, to comprehend well, to reason well. These are the essential activities of intelligence, which probably is very right, but again, difficult to measure those. But this is what they came up with. This is what you're probably most familiar with. This is kind of a variation of the Binet-Simon test. But it's now called the Stanford-Binet test. This is what you're probably familiar with, this idea of measuring, giving a number out of 100. This was actually adapted by a guy named Louis Terman, who took the Binet-Simon test, and he worked at Stanford, so it was renamed the Stanford-Binet test. But basically what it works out to be is your intelligence coefficient here, IQ, is equal to whatever your mental age is divided by your chronicle age, so how old you actually are, times 100, right? You've probably heard of what your IQ is, but this is how it worked. So you can imagine if you had a mental age of 12, but you were only 9 years old, really, you can do the math here, multiply by 100, and then you get an IQ of 133, which would be truly exceptional, okay? Or you can have a chronological age of 12 and a mental age of 9, and you can do the math, and you can see you would have an IQ of 75. All right. So that's basically how the calculation works there. And you can chart this, right? The way they worked this out was that 100 was kind of the middle, right? And then it's your standard bell, wherever, every standard deviation away from it adds another group of people, right? So about 70% of people have an IQ between 85 and 115, right? Between 70 and 130, that's where 95% of the population rests, right? So you might come across someone who's, almost 130, but they're truly not exceptional until they're getting to this mark of 130 and beyond, all right? Kind of interesting, though. Or conversely, on the other end, below 70, okay? Okay, so some of the challenges in defining intelligence, I've kind of been alluding to this as we've been talking. Is it really one thing, right? Is intelligence just a single thing? If you think back into the chapters that we've been going over so far, attention is not a single thing. Perception is not a single thing, really. Memory is not a single thing. So intelligence, likewise, could be multiple things. And if it's multiple things, how are those things related to one another, right? So it's really tough to say we just have this basic IQ and that is it for everything, right? So this actually led to the development of something called the two-factor theory of intelligence by a guy named Spearman. Okay, and there's essentially two factors, right? But there's kind of one and then multiple factors after that. So the first factor is called the general factor. This is what they call G, right? And this varies from person to person, but it stays kind of the same within a person for their lifetime, right? It's tough to change your own G to a certain extent, right? This is kind of your mental power per se. And then you have specific factors, right? So this is the second of the two-factor theory here. So specific factors, either specific abilities in different areas. So here's a simple one where you have your overall G, and then you have your specific factors in French or English or mathematics or music and so on and so forth, okay? And there's some implications of this. So first of all, we can say that specific abilities are correlated with each other, but not perfectly, all right? So you might be good at math and also English, but it might not be perfect, all right? And you might not have any music, for example, all right? But in part, what they're trying to say is that each specific ability, so all the specifics, are determined in part by G, kind of your overall, and then by the circumstances specific to that ability, which is probably schooling or environment or your education, right? So if G represents the amount of mental energy available to an individual, they think that it's probably hereditary would be the main determinant of G, but specific factors could be shaped by your environment and your schooling and your experiences in life, right? Which is probably pretty obvious, I think. Okay. So along those same lines, we have something versus we have another concept of crystallized versus fluid intelligence, right? So crystallized intelligence is basically this idea of the stuff that you've learned, right? So this could probably increase over life,